will be given by Henry Banner from the University of Stellenbosch, who also is the expert on Cape plants or Cape carnivorous plants, and he will today show to us one species we are probably all familiar with, namely the biggest of all, Sundew, Drosera regia.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Hello. There we go. Thank you very much, Andreas, and welcome to my talk on Drosera regia, history, biology, and conservation, presented by yours truly, Andrew Barnard. Let everyone get a seat. I am surprisingly popular today. So this quickly, my talk is split up into 4 sections. The first one, quickly on the discovery and taxonomy, Drosera regia. Second, biology. Third part of Drosera regia today in the 21st century. And lastly, the future of Drosera regia in this age of rapid change. Just quickly about me, as Andreas said, my name's Hendrik. I'm studying at the University of Stellenbosch. I'm doing a master's in plant biotechnology for orchid conservation. I'm also a full-time Drosera nerd. I would also just like to thank the GFP for inviting and giving me a grant to come talk here at this event. It's absolutely a dream of mine to come to one of these conferences since I started growing, and here I am giving a talk about the biggest and best Sundew in the world. So let's get into it. Drosera regia, the history and taxonomy. It was found just over 100 years ago in 1923 by a guy about my age, maybe my height, similar interests, by the name of Jack Rennie. He was busy exploring and voodoo bashing in Bainscliffe in South Africa, and he found this enormous Drosera that hadn't ever before been seen. It ended up being described in 1926 by Edith Stevens, a Cape Town botanist and mycologist, and interestingly is one of 3 or 4 Drosera species described by a woman, and it's the coolest one, so go team. It was initially placed in the section Psychophylla, which is a very primitive and old group of Drosera, including Drosera arcturei, and was later placed in its own section, section regiae, due to its very unusual traits, including woody rhizomes, operculate pollen, which no other Drosera have, and undivided styles, so it's separated from everything else. Some other scientists tried to separate it as its own genus, Phreatulina, in 1996, but a lot of people didn't like that, and it stayed that way. They also tried to separate tuberous sundews, which didn't go down too well. Genetically, there's been some work done by our famous Fernando over here, and many other people over the years, and it's shown to be pretty ancestral, splitting off its own little clade with Aldrovanda, and it's ancestral to all the other Drosera, which interestingly spread into Australia, these red guys, and you have the North American and South American, and then back to South Africa. So in South Africa, we have the youngest and the oldest species, which I think is pretty cool. So a bit of history about the finders. A lot of the regia cultivation was initially done by Hans Hatter, the first curator of the Stellenbosch University Town Garden. I suspect he found the first site that we went to, and he's most well known for growing the first Welwitschia mirabilis from seed to producing seed in cultivation in 1949. These plants are still at Stellenbosch University Town Garden and are almost 100 years old. He found Drosera regia by going into Bainscliffe with a helicopter, getting dropped off, and 4 days later he managed to find Drosera regia. You will see an ongoing trend in this talk is despite the immense size, they are incredibly difficult to find. Eric Green, as many of you I'm sure have known and met in person, I unfortunately missed him, was the main guide to Drosera regia in South Africa. He must have visited a lot over the years. This photo by Arendorf, or Bendorf, sorry, shows him near the habitat in Bainscliffe, South Africa. So it's a site I've seen many times. It's really, truly incredible. There's also been sites found apparently near Ceres, far away from Bainscliffe, and other historical sites that we'll talk about later. It entered cultivation widestream sometime around the 1980s. I'm not sure when. It was mentioned to have been cultivated in the description, but the first article I can find is in 1981 or 1980 in the Carnivorous Plant Network magazine, grown by Bob Zima, who noted its incredible ability to resprout after accidentally dumping salt on it, killing it, and then it grew back from the roots. So, real tough plant over here. So now we can get into the second section, the biology. So the morphology of Drosera regia is outstanding. It has these long, lanceolate, spear-shaped leaves, easily 35 to 40 centimeters in wild. Jeremiah told me that at Calcon they had some 50 centimeter long plants. It's quite incredible. In the description they mention leaves up to 70 centimeters, a fact that is often quoted in pop culture articles online. What they failed to mention is this was a severely etiolated plant. So it's probably the shadiest, meanest, greenest regia you've ever seen. Really not worth looking at. It also grows from a basal rosette, like a lot of Drosera. Has a woody rhizome, which I think is a trait only shared with Drosera arcturii in southern New Zealand. It has long, fleshy roots, lacks stipules on the leaves, which almost all other Drosera have, or have later lost. But this is for OG, it just doesn't have them. Had it before it was cool. And it has a percolate pollen, which no other extant species has. Has very intensely red to black trichomes in full sun in nature, so the photo doesn't show it super well, but these are darker than any Drosera trichomes I've ever seen. Most South African Drosera have a lovely bright crimson scarlet red. These guys just go goth, full dark. You also sometimes get red leaves or reddish pigment on the plants, but only very early in the season at high elevation sites where it's quite cold. After emerging from dormancy, these plants don't hold on to the coloration, so don't go poach them because they're red, because it really doesn't last. This site isn't cultivated, so you can't say that for sure. They also have incredibly aggressive curling as far as Drosera go. This poor ant queen was very severely wrapped up. They're very ravenous plants. It's noted in cultivation that they require heavy feeding, and it is seen in the wild. There's also a cultivar by the name of Twister, but I'm not too sure the history of that one. The flowers of Drosera regia, probably one of the most interesting things. If you think about a Drosera flower, you think of a nice radial dish-looking thing that points upwards the sky, cute little pink or white thing. Regia goes sideways. So they're mounted horizontally, and they're zygomorphic, which means they're divided right down the middle of the flower. They don't point upwards at all. They also have very interesting nectar guides, and so far I don't think a pollinator has been observed. I could be corrected. My suspicion is large carpet bees that are common in South Africa. So if you get a better look at the flower, it's very large, about 3 to 4 centimeters across, and there's these bright nectar guides that lead into the flower. I don't believe they do contain nectar. They also only have 3 undivided styles, whereas most Drosera have 3 divided into 6, and they have very nice big pollinia. They have sequential maturation to avoid self-pollination. What that means is on day 1, when they open, the styles are pretty closed, these little red ones, and the pollen is available for pollinators to pick up and take around, and on the next day, these styles will open up and be receptive. So they try to do that to avoid self-pollination, but they are self-fertile if you collect some pollen and pollinate the next day. Just to show you the difference between Drosera regia and a more standard flower, you can see here with 1, 2, 3 styles, whereas in Drosera sistiflora, it's divided at the base into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These also round and radially symmetrical, and act as a nice big landing pad for monkey beetles that pollinate them, but still for Drosera regia, we don't know what it is. The flowers are held on very large stems, about 40 to 50 centimeters in height, most likely to get them above the surrounding vegetation. They can have 6 to 20 flowers per stem, and it's usually forked in the middle. The most I've seen on one plant was 34 flowers. The seeds are also unusual for Drosera in the size. This plant in the wild only had about 1, 2, 3, 4 good seeds. The pollination rates can be quite spotty. They're 2 to 3 millimeters in length, which is enormous as far as carnivorous plants grow. The seed's almost sort of halfway to Drosera filament size, and they're crescent shaped compared to the typically round or very long thin seeds found in Cape Drosera. Unlike most other Cape Drosera as well, it goes dormant in winter. South Africa is famous for its winter growing summer dormant Sundews, but Drosera regia does the opposite. Up in the mountains it's pretty cold, so around April, after it's set its seed, it goes dormant until August, skipping the coldest months of the year and growing again in spring when it's nice and balmy. This photo by Martin Smith, the former curator of the town garden, shows a very crispy looking plant despite it still being wet. It's not a water related dormancy as Drosera that grow with them sympatrically, grow through the winter. The regia hides down, maybe there's not enough food in winter or something like that. In the spring months, they emerge from the woody basal rhizome, and they will grow a full set of leaves through a year, which dies back, rinse and repeat every year. I'm fairly sure the plants can get quite old. So as for the distribution and elevation, so far, sorry Matza?
Yeah, one question about the winter time there. What are the temperatures there in winter? Do you know that?
I'll get to it a bit more, but it gets down to near freezing in winter. It's quite cold. The people living on the pass do have wood piles outside their houses, which in South Africa is a sign it gets bloody cold.
Okay. Thank you.
But it's a pleasure. So So at the moment, they're only known from Bainscliff Pass in South Africa, mostly from this one river valley. The Bobby Arms River runs through here, and then in some of the surrounding areas, as my friend Michael for scale. So they're found between the elevations of 800 to 1,350 meters, so we get almost to the top of the mountains there in Bainscliff. So as for the seasonality in the weather, they live in Fynbos in the Cape, which is part of a Mediterranean climate, which means a very hot, dry summer, up to 35 degrees for several weeks in January to February, and dropping down to a mild, very wet winter, typically teenage temperatures in the day, down to single digits at night. And Bainscliff does get a bit colder, especially with wind. And the interesting thing about the Cape Mountains is they form a lot of fogs, even through the summer. So I can go in October in a nice springtime, and I still got soaked to the bone by these windy mountain fogs. It's not quite rain, it's worse. It permeates every surface because it blows sideways. You can't put like a rain jacket or a hat on. It gets everywhere. And these offer a nice relief from the sun, from the wind, and from this awful summer temperatures that I have to hike through. The sandstone that forms these mountains, as part of the Habaqua's sandstone famous, is incredibly porous and gathers a lot of water. These mountains are important water catchment areas for the city of Cape Town and other settlements, and it leaks water all year round, so the seeps that regia inhabit are typically permanent, just getting a bit weaker in the summertime. So the habitat for Drosera regia varies quite a bit. I'm sure a few people in this room have been to the site. You can see now why they're hard to find. They are in here somewhere. So this is the sort of typical mainland habitat. It's a very shallow graded seep, lots of famous plants with Restianaceae, one of the common plant families in the famous, lots of graminoids, some bulbs, just an interesting mix. It's a very nutrient poor soil. This area in particular is quite peaty, but the famous soils are typically devoid of any and all nutrients because they just get drained out constantly, and the plants are very tough and hold onto their nutrients. This other site, a little bit higher up, shows a preference for an open habitat. So you can see the opening kind of here on the edge of a ledge. They're growing up here nicely, and just behind them is a lot of vegetation, which they do also grow into and survive fine through. And they can survive in fairly older vegetation as well, which we'll get to in a bit, because a fire cycle in Fynbos goes through a 15 to 30 year cycle of very dense vegetation. It burns, it's open, and it slowly builds back up until you probably won't see another regia again. This is just another photo of that site. You can see they're growing very nicely on this edge here by the stones. There's water running through here, but even parts of it are quite dry. This is some sort of biofilm crust, and the regia is poking through the little peaty holes. It's quite dry. This stuff is crunchy. Sounds like a chips packet if you step on it. And the regia grow out of it quite well. I'm guessing it's quite a bit moister under the soil surface, but superficially it's quite dry. There's also some that grow in very overgrown spots, but they still persist. I mean, this population has quadrupled in size since the last fire. This is what is known as the upper waterfall location, if anyone is growing it. It's this one. And then there's probably the most interesting spot, where they're literally growing on a slab of rock in algae and detritus. And there's not a single other plant to be found up here. It's just for Drosera regia. We'll get a bit more to that later. There's a mature plant literally growing on the rock. So if you're struggling to grow Drosera regia, maybe get like a roof tile and go like that. So we can't speak about Fynbos without speaking about fire. When I wanted to go look at them in February earlier this year, this was going on just outside the pass. I went to stay with a friend. By the next morning, the fire was pretty much on the pass. I couldn't go. So Fynbos burns about every 10 to 30 years. And this photo was taken outside of Bainscliff and last burnt in about 2010. So it's 14 years, it's good timing. So there's a lot of Fynbos plants that go through a natural life cycle with the fire, such as proteas, which you can see dotted around here. They hold their seeds in cones, and the moment a fire comes through, the seed gets turned orange with protea seeds, and they sprout in a nice post-fire habitat. Other plants, such as the Drosera regia, are resprouters, which means they grow, they die, and kind of die back in the fire, and they grow back from their roots. It can also damage infrastructure. There's some houses up here in Bainscliff near Drosera Rufolio site, and a few of the houses in the middle got very badly torched, and these guys just had some broken windows and melted plastic. So the moral of the story is don't build in fire-prone habitats. So everyone always asks what grows with Drosera regia, so we'll get a bit to that. This is Drosera afra, a very common mountain rosetted species, currently synonymized with Drosera trinovia. It's incredibly common in the mountains. It's slightly distinct for having a bit of a rounder leaf, only grows up at high elevations, whereas Drosera trinovia you'll find everywhere from basically the coast up to the top of the highest mountains. You also get Drosera admirabilis. It's probably the most common and well-known companion. They're just absolutely beautiful at Bainskloof. This is a form that was introduced into cultivation as species floating. I know Andreas has described at length the very unique morphological characteristics that differ it, but Eric Green, I believe it was, that collected these.
Yeah, Eric Green introduced it under the name species floating.
Yeah. Okay, so it grows in very waterlogged areas, pretty much floating in the wintertime, but it is just admirabilis. And it's funny because it also likes to grow in rocks. You can see why them and regia are best friends. This is not the only one. There's a little crack that the root grew into. There are 3 or 4 like that. The root doesn't come out the bottom. I genuinely don't know. Drosera capensis, also a very famous, well-known species, grows in Bainskloof. There are some somewhere with the regia. I know there's several different Bainskloof, a stemmy Bainskloof and wide-leaf Bainskloof. I only managed to find the little crappy ones, but so be it. These are also winter dormant, like the Drosera regia, in high elevation sites, which is a trait that sometimes persists into cultivation, even under like normal, not freezing conditions. Drosera trinovia also grows everywhere. It's pretty much a weed. You can't kick a stone without hitting one in the Cape Mountains. It's also winter growing, but it uses that term very flexibly. I've had some that grow through summer. I don't care. And Drosera lycia is a fairly uncommon plant you get in the area. Generally grows slightly drier, so you won't find it in the seepage areas, but I've just fallen over in a bush in the slopes and there's a Drosera lycia. Look at me. Drosera rubrifolia is also in Bainskloof, but doesn't grow next to Drosera regia. This is one of the 3 sites that we know about, as well as the type location that Devitt took to his grave. So this site actually also burned this year, so just imagine this without all the greenery. That's still quite a nice red rubrifolia. Also up in the mountains with regia is Drosera variegata, a sistiflora type. The plants in Bainskloof are very short. The tallest we measured were about 12 centimeters. In the mountains they get pretty dwarfed. Up further north towards Nieuwertville are these monstrosities of plants. And they have a very cute, normally 2-tone flower from a slight white to a cute pink. And they love exposed areas and sands and moss banks and rocky slopes. I've a lot of photos of this plant and it confounds me to this day. And the other sistiflora type you get in that area is Drosera liniflora, a wet, very tall Drosera sistiflora with a small flower. It's only about 2 to 3 centimeters in diameter, just in contrast to the 5, 6, 7 centimeter monsters you often find in the lowland areas. And they can reach up to 40 centimeters in height. In the mountains in winter, you can find them on pretty much every like wet ledge and slope. Alex has taken photos for us in Bainskloof where you just see red sparkles, the entire cliff faces. They're just so abundant. And of course, Utricularia buscamata, the carnivorous herpes in cultivation. In the wild, it's really pretty. Lovely, nice pink skirt. Yellow face. The Utricularia lovers will kill me for this terminology, but so yeah, it's very common with Drosera regia. It acts as an annual in some places where it dries up, but if it's wet enough, it will persist over seasons. And of course, the pride and joy of South Africa, Dysa uniflora. This was photographed near the Drosera regia as well. In stream banks, a funny little bit of history is Louis Vogelpoel, a famous cardiologist and Dysa grower from South Africa, was looking for Dysa orchids in Bainskloof, trudging through his seeps, and he felt something slimy on his leg. He turned around, Drosera regia, found it by accident, the luckiest man I think to ever have lived. This might be the spot that we go to commonly, I'm not sure who found that one. And there's some herpetofauna as well, some little cute banded stream frogs. You can see the shadow of the regia up here. It's a very cute little montane clicking frog. So then the prey items of regia. When I said it was hungry, I meant it. When I went earlier this year in March, these moths were prey item number 1. And I watched this one get caught and struggle and eventually succumb. Call me cruel, but it was interesting. They really wrap around them. You can see a moth up here. This is a termite alate, but you see all manner of flies, bees, unidentifiable blobs of insect. They eat a lot. But they are also the victims to herbivory. I have a frustrating habit of antelope eating flower stems of Drosera sistiflora that I really have been looking for years. And Drosera regia is no different. You can see the ends of this plant have been pretty well nibbled, and it happens every so often. The exposed plants, Drosera, are nice and tender and delicious compared to the very hard, sharp, bitter fynbos plants. So that takes us to Drosera regia in the 21st century. I've visited it a few times in the past few years at great effort. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever done physically. You look at its elevational profile of a hike, starts at 600 meters, end around 1400, up, down, down, with about 4,000 feet or 1,400 meters of climb and descent in one day. But you do get to swim in the cold mountain streams, which is incredibly pleasant when it's 33, 34 degrees out, which is common around the time Drosera regia is flowering. So we have 5 known localities at the moment. The main one is the wetland at Beinskloof, that I think pretty much everyone who goes to South Africa tries to visit. We have some above the waterfall, which is cultivated. We have some on the mountainside, and a wet wall, which I showed you earlier. Those were discovered recently, I think in the past 10 years. I was one of the first people to go visit them again. And then there's some at the waterfall at the end of the Beinskloof Valley. This is the type location where Jack Rainey discovered it initially. I went there, but without an exact spot. It's hard to find. It turns out I was looking on the wrong side of the waterfall. But I'll get to that now. So the main spot, this is just the same habitat full of restios, graminoid plants, Bruniaceae. Pretty common. This fynbos is now about 13, 14 years old. It's pretty mature growing in, but the regia still persist. There's a really nice clump of them here. So at this population, we counted about 350 plants, 83 of which were flowering. This is by far the most floriferous population. And they're at about 800 meters above sea level, so it's also the lowest spot. I think this is where they were introduced to cultivation initially. This is by far the easiest spot to get to, and doesn't require personal sacrifice and a lot of blood. So if you want to see Drosera regia, this is probably the spot. Here's a photo of it after fire in 2010 by Martin Smith. So you can see if we go away. That's what it looks like today. So the succession is pretty stark. You can see the restio clumps down here. This is where they resprout from. So now we have above the waterfall. This is a really dense grassy spot, 1,050 meters above sea level. There's about 54 plants, 8 of which were flowering. A count done last year that I found online, I think by Andreas, was about 12 plants 10 years ago. I might have been by Zoe Paulson. It's entirely possible there's more plants in the area. This is incredibly dense and grassy. See, I'll give you guys 10 seconds to see if you can spot the regia in this photo. There they are. I had to use the late afternoon sun glow to find them. Even though I had the exact coordinates, it still took me about 30 minutes to find them. They hide incredibly well. Then on the mountainside, this is the highest elevation spot, 1,350 meters above sea level. There's about 280 plants, 8 of which flowered, and it grows on the northern slopes of this mountain and in the edge of seep areas. So there's a whole seepage back here. That's why the grass grows well, but they really just love this open bed where the water starts cascading down into just minor streams and things that feed into the Bobbejans River. It's a bit drier than some of the other spots. Some follow the stream directly, and there's others a few meters either side in what you really wouldn't think Drosera would grow in, actually. It's just another nice photo of them. These plants in late summer truly as well. Yes, Matze?
Another question, what is the other plant growing next to the regia? Is it a lycopodium?
Your guess is as good as mine. I'm a Drosera nerd, not a fynbos nerd. Someone has asked me this before, but I've forgotten.
It's very interesting.
They are really cool. I mean, there's something for everyone. I know why the Germans love South Africa so much, because we have some equal plants.
Looks like Asteraceae perhaps, or one of these endemic families. It's not like what.
Yeah, it is Asteraceous, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of mature plants at this site. I don't know when this one burns, because it was only discovered, I think, in 2015. Both of the waterfall and the site were discovered by one mad mountaineer who saw them flowering from miles away and managed to climb. It's an awful hike, but yeah. So you can see this is again that biocrust that they're growing out of. There's a better view of your interesting plant. But they also grow quite well in the mature vegetation. Like, I think it'll still take another few years for them to get crowded out. And then we have my favorite spot, the waterfall. This is really fascinating. It's at 1,250 meters above sea level. And at this spot, there are about 210 plants growing on the wall itself and also at its feet. there are a lot of invasive trees in this area, so I expect there would be a lot more without them there, something I'll get to now. So I grow pretty much until the foot of the wet wall where the trees start growing. So they start growing a bit later. In September, if you go, you can find some nice 20 centimeter tall regia at the lowest spots. This was in October, they were just barely starting to grow. They had this very nice red sheen early in the season, which disappeared later on as it got warm. I suspect the nights up here are incredibly cold, which probably contributes to the pigmentation. And this is what the plants look like in March. They are enormous, they are beautiful. They went to floriferous despite being quite open, but I suspect there could be various other factors at play. I think there might be fire stimulation, or who knows. And then I have a very exciting announcement to make. We have a new population. Not far from this wet wall, discovered while falling over pine tree debris and thick fynbos. I happened to stumble upon these, literally. So this is the nice patch that we found in the open. There's me for scale. There are about 1,000 plants in the vicinity of this. About half the known Drosera regia are just in this one, probably 100 square meter area, and I found them by falling over them. You can't blame me though, this is what most of them look like. I was climbing down towards the wet wall, and I slipped and I said, Andre, it's Drosera regia. And oh, fantastic. And yeah, unfortunately they're extremely shaded and they do need urgent intervention, which I'll get to. And then there's a waterfall at the end of Bainskloof where they originally discovered. I have a letter written by the discoverer Jack Rennie 40, 50 years after the discovery, correcting the description paper, saying he found them up there somewhere. I looked on the wrong side. I didn't take a camera with me or my GPS, because to get there, you have to climb up to a small waterfall, swim across here, climb up there, go over there, and then there, in there somewhere. It's a nice swim though. Highly recommend it if you're in the area. So this population, from what I've been told, is fairly small, only about 10 to 20 plants. It's probably just seeds that get caught, washed down from the higher plateau. I don't think this population is cultivated, but I'm not really too sure. So now we get to the unfun parts of conservation threats. The main ones for Drosera regia are invasive trees, followed by changing fire regimes, potential harvesting, and climate change. So invasive trees are a thorn in the side of every fynbos lover, because you see them everywhere and you hate it. So in Bainskloof we have two main species, the cluster pine and the hakia, which is an Australian protea, ironically, growing in the protea land and outcompeting them. So the main issue with invasive trees is they're very competitive for light. You can see this canopy is so thick. And these are only 3 or 4 year old pine trees. They get bigger and bigger. You can see the old ones here that died in the previous fire. They easily get 10 to 15 meters tall. They drink several hundred liters of water a day, multiplied by 1,000 trees, and you end up with the aquifers drying up. They outcompete all the other plants, and I consider these to be the biggest threat to Drosera regia in the wild. So the cluster pine, as I mentioned, is a tall coniferous tree. It was introduced to South Africa for wood production, and it's still farmed quite intensively. It makes a lot of wind-dispersed seeds, so you see it on pretty much every mountain ridge in the Cape. You look on any mountain, you look to the rockiest, weirdest part, like even up here, and there's a pine tree, which makes them very hard to control because they get around very far and difficult to get to areas. Thankfully, it does not resprout after fires. Small efforts have been made to control it near the above waterfall population in the recent years by the UCT Ski Club, led by Zoe Paulson. But in the past 5 years, they've absolutely dominated the big wetland where a new population of regia is, which also surrounds the waterfall, which may risk drying it up in the future as the trees get bigger. The silky needlebush, or hakia, is an Australian protea, which is quite ironic. And unlike the pine, it's serotinous, relying on fire for its life cycle. So they store their seeds in these pods along the plant, and after a fire, the tree dies, but these pods disperse seed everywhere. Thankfully, it's not so much of a problem anymore, as there's a lot of biological control that's been released, so they make pretty much no seed, and they don't grow as big as they used to. It's still, however, spiky as hell, and I really hate it, because there's nothing worse when you slip and you just grab onto a needly tree. Needle bush is very fitting. So changing fire regimes can also be a problem for Drosera regia. It's a big issue elsewhere in the Cape, where if you burn too often or leave too long between burns, it can really throw out the fire dynamic. If you burn too often, the reseeders cannot grow enough to make seed in seed bank, and you can also burn through the seed bank very quickly. If you leave it too long, the vegetation gets far too dense. This is an issue on Table Mountain, where it hasn't burnt for up to 70 years in areas. It needs to burn every 10 to 30. So any Drosera cuneifornia onto a mountain, you just see on the right side of the path. So continuing with the invasive trees and fires, invasive trees have a far larger biomass than any natural fane moss, so they have 10 to 30 times the fuel load. Fane moss fires are supposed to be fairly quick, not burning too hot, but if you add trees to it, you can burn all the way through the soil, you get erosion, you kill the seed bank. It's really detrimental. So bad fires and bad trees really can just completely destroy habitat. Alex and I have been to sisterflora sites where it's just like a few plants in the shade and there's literally pretty much nothing else growing around because all the nice soil has been eroded. It's just hard clay and blue gums. Harvesting, I've not observed personally. In the past, it might have been an issue. It's definitely a problem for Nepenthes, for tuberous Drosera in Australia, and Sarracenia in North America. At the moment, I don't think any regia is being poached. It's easy enough to get in cultivation. I already bought 5 today. There is a risk of location data plants being valuable to collectors, which is why I think it's still a good idea to obscure the locations as far as possible. But morphologically, they're all the same. It's nothing more than a name tag at that point. There's some cool elevation data on it. But I do get it. I do grow these plants, but I think they're pretty safe where they are at the moment. Only I can count on my one hand the number of people that know about the high elevation sites' exact location. And the red plant's also not worth collecting because it doesn't last. I know there was a photo of a red seedling in Japan. I spoke to the Japanese growers and the guy said it was very stressed and will probably die. So. Climate change is also a pretty fundamental issue for plants across the world. However, its effects are quite hard to predict. A common issue is obviously global warming, and plants will often climb up the mountains to where it's cooler to stay within an elevational range. But Drosera regia is almost at the top of its range already. These lower populations can still climb if it's wet, but the ones on the mountainside are not probably 50 to 100 meters in elevation from the peak, and they're very selective about their habitats, even in the area. So I'm not sure how much further or where they can go if climate change really gets bad. So getting to the exact red list statuses, they have 2 different ones. At the moment, for the IUCN criteria, in a paper in 2020 by Cross et al., they're listed as critically endangered due to the very low range of occurrence and also very large fluctuations in population levels. However, I think this is part of the natural fane moss cycle. For many plants, they'll have a time where they really peaked, they make a lot of seeds, and they start getting outcompeted, and there's a fire, and they come back again. So it's hard at the moment to quantify, and I think over time, with more surveys, we'll have a better idea of what happens. According to Sundew, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, they're listed as rare in 2011, mostly with a threat from collecting. The justification was they're uncommon, but there's likely a lot of them that are undiscovered in the mountains, which doesn't surprise me since even I struggle to find them. If you don't know where they are, you just simply do not see them. I think we got very lucky that there's been some mountaineers that managed to find them. There's a suspicion I also have that the plants move around within their habitats, so sometimes you don't always find all of them. Some they'll set seed and they'll grow obviously where it's ideal. Maybe these plants get smothered, but the seedlings grow over here. In the ones I found at the upper waterfall were about 100 meters from the coordinates I had. So I've had bad coordinates, or they really just like to shuffle. So that brings us to the future of Drosera regia. The first thing I need to do is try and find some of the lost populations. This photo out of the description paper is several kilometers from where the Drosera regia live naturally. So on this map, this red square more or less encompasses a range of Drosera regia. This photo is down here. And I've yet to go have a hike here. It is a fairly well-traveled area, but so far nobody's been able to see them in the past 100 years or so. It was actually found by a guy with the same surname as me in 1920-something. It was mentioned in the description, and they're all herbarium specimens, but 100-year-old herbarium specimens are often vague at best. There's also records potentially of them growing down here in Slanghoek. This is the Slanghoek Valley. There's records that I've heard about growing with a rare erica that's endemic to this area. It grows over here and over here. And the serious records are all the way off the map there. The serious ones I went and looked for. It's a fairly new record, about 20 years. A nursery owner in South Africa saw them while on a multi-day hike. However, in a very South African fashion, or a very South African way to lose data, his laptop was stolen from his car. So no images exist. So there's this very extensive wet wall system. There's massive rock cracks, lots of trees, lots of seepages. This is a photo I took with a drone, but I've yet been unable to locate them. It's a massive wall, so if you look, this little bit in the corner here, We go on, there's my brother, it's massive, it's probably easily 40 meters tall by 100 meters wide. It's a bit of a needle in a haystack. I'm hoping later this year I can go with the guys so he can show me exactly where they were, because I've driven 2.5 hours each way 3 times to look for them, and so far I've been unsuccessful. As for controlling invasive trees, the hakias, as I mentioned, are very well contained by biological control agents. So they took its natural enemies from Australia, like the hakia seed weevil, that severely limit the tree's ability to make seeds to continue growing. The ones that are left are often very sickly. However, the problem for pines is they're still grown for wood. The wood industry does not want bugs and things being released that will damage trees, so there remains a bit of a problem. There's actually research done on the Cape, and the cost of invasive pine trees on water resources and alien invasive control and loss of biodiversity has cost for Cape more than it has made in profits from farming pine trees. So it might not have been worth it, but this was started several hundred years ago and they didn't know any better. So my solution is heli hacking. As the name implies, it is hacking trees based off a helicopter. So it's an expensive but incredibly effective technique for hacking down trees in remote areas. It's expensive though. For a 3-day heli hack with 20 volunteer choppers, the equipment, helicopter, pilot time, etc., it costs about 20,000 euros or 400,000 South African rand. However, in that time, including some serious cliff face work, they managed to cut down 27,000 trees, which is a cost of less than €1 per tree, and these were much larger than the ones in Bainscliff as well. They did the math, and it's about 6 times as effective as just hiking in and cutting trees down on Table Mountain, which is fairly easy to hike into. In Bainscliff, it's about 4 hours each way to the regia. So a helicopter would be far more effective, and in one 3-day heli hack, you could clear the entire water catchment area, although a lot more work would be needed to clear out the surrounds. That's why I suggest plan B, burning them. So, as you can see here, the area outside of Bainscliff burnt earlier this year. It was a 200 square kilometer fire over the course of about a week. So it burned fairly slowly, and it was controlled at the Bainscliff Pass, the plants on the other side. But it's an opportune time to burn the fynbos. It will kill all your old trees, and afterwards you just simply have to hike up there and pull out the saplings. It's much easier than cutting down trees with chainsaws. However, there's a lot of logistics and paperwork involved, and if anyone can convince Cape Nature to set fire to anything, I will give them all the regia they want. The other option that is very useful for plants is ex situ conservation. So these plants are grown by Nigel Hewitt-Cooper in the UK. He holds a South African collection for the Ark of Life, which is a carnivorous plant conservation project. So Drosera regia is grown very widely in cultivation from at least 2 locations. I know Nigel has a lot of different seed accessions collected by Silverhill Seeds over the years. But as far as I know, they're all from the lowest slopes. Silverhill didn't really keep comprehensive records of their collections, unfortunately, which is usually what you do when you don't have collection permits for nature reserves. Comprehensive ex situ genetically managed conservation is important. It's done extensively in South Africa for rare species, and it's nice to have a backup, but it is a poor substitute for really good in situ conservation. So you want to do a bit of both. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for listening. Before you clap, I have one small bit of other news. This is, unlike Alex, I only have one Drosera species to describe. However, I think this one is equally interesting. It grows here, on the edge of the suckling Karoo, the lowest rainfall region in the country. And these I only saw earlier in the season, but it's a rosette Drosera that reaches 9 centimeters across. It has a bigger diameter than Drosera quinifolia, and it only grows in 2 sites that I know of out here. If anyone has a 4x4 lying around for me that I can go back to them with, I would appreciate it, but I'm hoping to publish that later this year. So thank you so much for being a fantastic audience and for pitching up here. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So thank you, Henry, for this wonderful talk. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Start with Matze.
Have you ever seen a white flower form there?
I've not in the wild. I know you do grow it.
Yeah, but that was not a question. But yeah, I do. But as I know, my plants, they also come from nature, so it should be a natural thing with the white flower.
It isn't uncommon for you to find white flower Drosera in the wild. Does it have red tentacles still?
Yeah, but not so.
Yeah, so it might be more of an albino form. I know Alex has seen quite a few different albino species. I've seen albino Drosera rubrifolia, which I love because it's a green red leaf Sundew. So it can definitely pop up naturally. I was supposed to see them at peak flower, but the fire kind of prevented me from doing so. So that last flower I only found the 1,350 meter spot because they flower a bit later. The ones lower down were already setting seed. So next year, hopefully, I can see them in flower.
I can add a bit of information about this. There was a single individual of white-flowered individual which was collected by regia for Bonn Botanical Garden. He didn't have any collection permits, but I was able to trace back. This comes from the lowland population, and it was the only individual. And they had a pure white-flowered one, but they crossed it also in cultivation with the other regias. So I think many of them have traces of pink, but these originate from cultivation. And apparently he really collected, he digged out the early white-flowered individual which he found there.
You have no idea how many stories out of that.
Yeah, sure. My plant is from cultivation, but it originally came someday from the wild.
Yes, every plant in cultivation. Right. Except, I think, white capensis, which originated in cultivation.
It doesn't pop up by seedlings in cultivation.
Yeah.
It was a wild collected plant.
Yeah. Okay. So, further questions?
I try to connect to this conversation about white flower. Drosera regia, because I grow this plant in my collection, and it looks this plant is sterile. It's impossible to pollinate this plant, and the idea is that this plant should be from Bonn, but I don't know. I grow it maybe 6 years, and I was not successful to pollinate this plant. But I know that the growers in Germany try to pollinate them and make some variety of coloration from white to dark pink.
Did you both try it as a pollen parent and as a seed parent?
I try to pollination both ways, but I was not successful because the white flower plants don't produce the pollen, and the stigmas stay closed. So it's my experience about white flower Drosera regia.
Questions to
I was wondering, you talked about the soil being very nutrient deprived because of the seeps that carry away all the nutrients. Now, in cultivation, we often put a little bit of fertilizer for Drosera regia, also for the roots. Is there a reason why Drosera regia, even though in nature it's in very low nutrient conditions, that it can take up nutrients maybe more easily than other Drosera? Is there like a historic sort of reason?
It might be just due to its very ancestral state and also just a large size of plant. I also think carnivorous plants generally are a little more fertilizer tolerant than we give them credit for. I think it's just very easy to overdo it, and then people say fertilizer is bad, but I hose my regia down with fertilizer at home, and I know a lot of other people do it. Some people say you can't grow it without fertilizer at all. It's just such a large biomass plant. I'm not sure why it would be more tolerant of nutrition. I think maybe just a bigger plant, it's a bit hardier, and it doesn't get fried quite so easily. They have very thick, fleshy roots, so I suspect they're just quite resistant to easily just getting burnt. Because I have most definitely fried Drosera with fertilizer before, but regia seems to take it very well.
further questions?
That's a question. So is there now 5 different locations? Are there conservation efforts to keep every strain in cultivation, or is there something in planning?
So at the moment there's nothing. The Stellenbosch University Botanical Garden used to have quite a few under the previous curator, but they're one of those fairly difficult plants that during the transition died out. I might try and get the garden to collect the different strains and keep them ex situ and I know there are some at the Millennium Seed Bank, but I can probably get the other populations as well, because I do my master's through the Botanical Garden there. It's just very difficult to get permits. They're in a nature reserve, so legally no collection is allowed. I know sometimes there are spades taken to South Africa in general, but as a whole, the habitat is well protected. I think it would be a good idea to make backups of the different populations. It's just, someone's going to have to ask me very nicely to go back when they don't look good. It's a really, really awful hike.
Okay, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Regarding ex situ and in situ conservations, I will talk about this tomorrow, but generally, as long as the habitat is okay and there's no urgent threat, why do we want to do ex situ conservation? It's just collecting plants then, reducing individuals from the natural gene pool. Ex situ conservation comes to into play when natural habitat is really threatened, that you need to preserve the gene pool, because there is no thing such as ex situ conservation. You have to protect the natural habitat. Everything else is just growing plants, because you don't preserve the natural pollinators, the associated biota, and so on. So ex situ conservation should always be the ultimate ratio when anything else in situ does not work. But this is my personal opinion. You will hear more about this tomorrow. Further questions about Drosera regia or Henry? If not, then do the organizers want to give some concluding remarks? Or should I do? So I will just say what everybody heard today said. Thanks very much for organizing this. It was an amazing diversity of different talks today. Learned a lot. Thank you to all the speakers and to you, the audience. Have a nice evening.